Hello, everybody. Welcome to another installment of Philosophy 101 video lectures. Tonight we're going to finish up, get as close as we can to finishing up Plato and the Theatetus, and what Plato has to say about this discussion about knowledge. So, as my goofy little cartoon here is saying, we're wondering what is knowledge. The first, gosh, I fixed the mirroring thing, but it's kind of hard for me to get my brain to work that way. Um, the first proposal was like looking at certain examples of things that we would count as knowledge. And that doesn't work because that doesn't give us the essence of knowledge. We want to understand what are the necessary and sufficient conditions to know things. And just citing different examples of knowledge is not going to do that for us. So that answer was quickly dismissed. And then the one that we spent a lot of time talking about this morning is this option. Is knowledge just perception? So if I perceive something, do I therefore know it? Are those the conditions for knowledge? Remember, that's in trying to understand the essence of knowledge here. It's mostly about what are the standards that I need to fulfill in order to be said to know something. Maybe the only standards that are required are perception. But as we started talking about this morning, that gets into problems with relativism. The idea that knowledge is just based on perception is going to ultimately be a relativistic kind of answer, in that it's going to say basically, in as much as we have different perceptions, we all have different knowledge. That even if perceptions conflict, or they're in some kind of contrast with each other, or maybe even mutually exclusive logically, the theory would have to say that all of them count as knowledge. So we're going to eventually get to this question of, well, what could it be instead then? And remember that theme that I was talking about this morning about how in this discussion that Plato and Theaetetus are having about the nature of knowledge, every time we get an answer that doesn't work out, we always get some kind of clue about what the next answer might be. And I'm going to try to walk you through that process as I go through the different answers that we get from the Plato reading. Okay, so there's still some more stuff for us to do with this perception, this perception theory of knowledge. When they talk about perception, they're being pretty open about it. There hasn't been any kind of clarification about any kind of particular type of perception that is what counts as knowledge or something like that. The way that they treat it in the document is just that knowledge comes from how things seem to us. So that means any kind of way in which I form a judgment about like how things appear to me, that's supposed to be correct and count as knowledge under the perception theory. So that's where we get into issues, because I had this little drawing up this morning of, well, I've got two different people. I got these dinosaurs, so let's work with them. So this dinosaur is saying, what he says is true is P. Some claim P. And this one's like, that's not how I see it, and he says not P. And this theory that knowledge is just perception, they both have a different perception. They're both right, even though they're mutually exclusive answers here. One person's saying something is true, and the other person is saying that exact same thing is false. But they both count as knowing what they know under the perception model. The first objection that we got from Plato about this was that this is going to conflict with a lot of our pre-theoretical notions about how knowledge works and how it behaves, and just how we think about knowledge ordinarily. That remember, Plato was saying, if in emergencies at no other time will you see people adopt this kind of attitude about knowledge, that when the chips are really down, that we think some people really know more than other people do. Some people have greater knowledge, they have greater understanding, they have greater wisdom, and so we trust what they say more than maybe what we think. Or we think we're an authority on it, and so maybe we judge ourselves, correctly or incorrectly, to have more knowledge than somebody else. So there seems to be some other sort of standard for knowledge. The perception theory doesn't make room for this kind of possibility that some people could know more than others, or that someone could be mistaken in what they think or what their perception is telling them about what is true, and what we have knowledge of. So that's the problem for the perception theory, that it can't accommodate that, because it says everyone kind of has equal knowledge all the time. No one is going to be knowing more than anyone else, because everything just always is as it seems to you. If you learn under a relativistic model of knowledge, all you're really doing is just changing your perception and thus what is true for you or what counts as knowledge for you. There's no sense here of growth or increase or any sort of other kind of universal standard, some kind of other metric that holds these figures and anybody else to some kind of standard for whether they know. Because knowledge under this model is just perception, and that's it. Before I go any further, we got some people in the chat tonight. How's the lecture going this morning? I wanted to just check in. I hope there's some more people, but we'll work with whoever's here. Just if there are any kind of questions that I could clarify before we go on and start talking about more things. It seemed like just the notion of what relativism was something that we had to explain a little bit, and I just want to make sure you guys are understanding it and following pretty well. Any questions come up that you guys wanna ask about? I'm gonna make a little bit of time for that right now. So Alexa, you thought you were a relativist, but then realized you weren't. I don't know what you mean by the loop for perception, Daniel.
That thing I talked to you about after class, where if someone believes something that relativism is true, but 1,000 people believe that it's not true.
Yeah, that's where we're going next. That's the next thing I'm going to talk about. Yeah. So we'll get to that. All right, no other questions you guys want to ask? I really miss having the live class where I can look people in the face and kind of scope out whether it's making sense or not. I get to see a couple of your faces. I appreciate that. Sometimes I look down, see how things are going. I'm too much of a empathy dude, I guess. Too emotionally sensitive. It's kind of hard to give these disembodied lectures. Why do we give titles to ideologies that make no sense? Woo! That's laying the gauntlet down. I do want to speak to that a little bit. So I don't think that relativism is something that is sort of uncontroversially stupid and misguided. I think there are some serious problems here, and we're about to look at the most serious question of all. The biggest sort of objection to relativism as a way to think about truth or about knowledge or anything else, anything related to truth. But with those deep problems, it doesn't mean that it's automatically like a dead option. Like I was saying this morning, relativism has a lot of motives behind it. So much motivation that it keeps popping up. I've had some philosophy classes where almost the entire class were really diehard relativists. They're just really keen on that way of thinking about truth. And I think that there's some attraction to the theory. I think looking at some of its implications might get you to rethink it, but there's still something that's going on here that needs to be dealt with. Relativism may not die such a quick, easy death. Let's put it that way. And as the quarter goes on, and we look at some other readings too that are going to touch on this subject, you'll see, I think, why it's kind of a pernicious theory that we have to deal with. So because it's a perspective we have to deal with, we want to give it a name so that we can talk about it and remind ourselves about it. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, Cameron. I guess that gets into a deeper level of personal growth and understanding.
I feel like relativism is I can apply it to maybe personal things, like your favorite color, like your favorite food or TV show. That's like a truth for you, but maybe not like a truth for a universal truth or something.
Yeah.
Or you can't. Yeah, like math. Like you can't say oh, I got this answer for a math problem. That's the truth. That's the right one when it's actually the wrong one or something. I think it works for some things, but I mean for, I don't know, maybe the greater truths, it doesn't really work.
And there certainly are people who are relativists about particular domains of knowledge and not others. I would say, I know many more contemporary philosophers who they may not be like a relativist across the board, but the most common combination I see is like, well, when it comes to like descriptive natural truths, like the kind of stuff that science teaches us about, that has absolute objective universal truth, like the realist notion of truth. But when it comes to say moral matters, like moral truth might be relativistic. That there is no objective universal truth about moral matters. But even there, it gets really tricky. So what I might say here is that for right now, let's understand what relativism is. I want to make sure that everyone in the class here has a good understanding of what relativism is claiming. Recognize that we might have some sympathies for it. Look at the kind of arguments that Plato is offering that offer kind of like a serious dilemma or challenge to whether relativism is even intelligible at all, which is really what the next objection is going to do. And then kind of like be okay leaving it at that for now, because the debate will keep going. We're going to continue that discussion further in the class, and you'll hear a little bit more about it. So yeah, I think like Alexa, you're saying like I'm partly relativistic, or I have some sympathies with them. I think that's very reasonable. I think if we weren't able to figure out how it would be possible to sympathize with this view, then there's something that we're missing still. Like otherwise, why does the view keep coming back? Why does it keep perennially appearing in every generation? Every generation is like, hey, what about this relativism idea? Like, and then people are like, no, man, we talked about that. I thought we agreed that relativism was false. And then someone always is like, this seems like a good idea. So I think that there's something deeper to understand here.
There's always a kook in every generation, I think.
What was that?
Know, maybe that's the wrong way. Maybe there's always that one guy, like that, or that one girl, just some dumbass.
Whoa.
I don't know.
I mean, that's what I'm trying to get away from. Like, I'm trying to get away from the kind of ridiculing of relativism, because I think there's things that we can like authentically sympathize with, rather than just being like, oh yeah, I used to be stupid like you, or something like that, something really patronizing or something of that nature.
Yeah.
We'll keep looking at it. We'll keep listening to it. Let's see here. Okay, all right. I'm gonna move on for right now. Let's take a look at the biggest objection here to relativism, and then we'll see where the debate's gonna take us next. All right. So remember we had our two figures here who were having the disagreement, and we were seeing how like relativism would say basically they're both right. They both know what they know, even though they have directly contrasting opinions. Now, instead of it just being some claim or other, let's say that there's like a bunch of people over here. So, T-Rex is here with a whole gang of people. And they are like what Plato is talking about as like most of us. That most of us have these like realist intuitions. Like we do think that some people know more than others, or that we can be wrong in our knowledge. So they basically are committed to saying that relativism is false. Okay? So that's what they all say. All these people say that. And here's Protagoras over here. And the way things seem to him is that relativism is true. He's all for it. Yay, relativism. So to Protagoras, you guys see it there? So to Protagoras, he thinks relativism is correct. And then there's all these other people who are not relativists that have these like major intuitions for realism. Now, Protagoras and anyone who's going to defend this kind of relativistic account is in a weird sort of bind here, because what are they going to say about the judgments of these other people? Are they going to say they got two options? They can say that they're true, or they can say that they're false. Those are the two options. Those are the only two options. So both options are going to be bad ones for relativism. This is called the dilemma. Like that there's usually set up some kind of like logical possibilities here that's exhaustive. That really Protagoras is going to have to say something about the judgment of all of these people who say relativism is false. Because that's how things seem to them. That's what their perception tells them. He's only got two possible answers here. He can say that what they're saying is true, or what they're saying is false. There's no other option here. If the dilemma is going to work. And under each option, we're going to get a kind of bad answer or an objectionable answer. So if all the options are bad, then the dilemma has sort of defeated the position. So let's look at what will happen if Protagoras says that what they're saying is true or what they're saying is false. Let's start with true. If Protagoras says that what all these people are saying is true, because relativism says that however things seem to you, that's the truth for you, then he'd have to say that relativism is actually false for these people. In other words, he'd have to endorse that his own theory is incorrect. That seems to be defeating his own theory, just straightforwardly. And if it's not quite clear how that would happen, Plato takes it even one step further. He says, what if Protagoras decided at one point that he was wrong? That he changed his mind, that he was like, you know what, I used to think relativism was true, now I don't think it's true. Well then, if everyone's saying that relativism is false, then the idea of relativism is a truth for no one. So that's also a logical possibility here that's going to get the relativistic account into trouble. Okay, so that's what's going on here with if he says that it's true. If you guys have any questions about that, put them in the comment thing and I'll try to address them. Pretty much keep up on that for this lecture and kind of moving forward. Like, if questions are happening, definitely drop them in there and I'll try to get in and bring them in as I can. Because sometimes these arguments are a little complicated and they have multiple steps, and I want to make sure you guys are following along as much as possible. Okay, so that's if Protagoras says that what these people are saying is true. So he doesn't want to do that because then he's going to have to basically say his own theory is wrong. But what if he sticks to his guns here and says, actually, relativism is true. Even though you guys don't say it's true, it's actually true. In other words, he would say that what they're saying is false. But what happens now? If Protagoras says that even though it seems this way to them, it isn't true, then he's basically violating his own principle of relativism, which says that however things seem to you, however you perceive them to be, that's the truth for you. So he's saying, despite how things seem to them, they're actually wrong. That violates the major principle of relativism. And that's where we get a real problem here for relativism. This is in short, this is saying that the position is self-defeating, that it cannot be consistently maintained even on its own terms. Just looking at its own claims about what it's saying is true, it's rationally inconsistent. And the probably the strongest way of putting this objection is to say it's actually unintelligible. That I don't know what it would mean for relativism to be true, because it's self-defeating in this sort of nature. So, okay, Cameron asks, so how doesn't relativism just completely deny truth? Well, that was kind of the idea of relativism, was to preserve some way in which there is truth. The other option would be like some really, really radical fatalism about truth. I would say there's no such thing as truth whatsoever. That option seems very problematic at best, and maybe this could be something that deserves further investigation and further consideration. But just at the outset, I mean, let's look at that claim at face value here. So something is happening, right? There's like reality happening. That's all maybe we really mean by truth, is like that there is something that is happening. So maybe there's truth in that sense. To deny truth would be to say that there's like maybe nothing that can be said at all about anything, and it's not even really a matter of what you can say about it. Like, if to say that there's sort of truth, this concept of truth is that there just is a reality that is a certain definitive way. That's all that we're really committed to.
But isn't truth like the deeper meaning behind the reality that we perceive? There's everything that we perceive, but truth is something more than that, at least from my understanding.
I think when philosophers are talking about truth, they're talking about it in a really thin, not a lot of baggage sort of thing. Like the way that that there's something in common here between saying like it's true that this pen is black, and it's true that compassion is the most important moral value. I mean, even like these really rich things and these really like thin claims, there's whatever this truth thing is something that they both share.
Gotcha.
Okay, so far so good? All right. All right, so there goes the perception theory. But you know, let's start with our little charity here about relativism, and or at least with the perception theory. So why would we think? So if this theory doesn't work, and at least if we're just following along with the debate in the Theatetus, it doesn't seem to be like a really viable option given Plato's objections. At least where the debate is with relativism so far, perception theory seems pretty dead, like a dead end. But is it so much of a dead end? What might have originally got us to think about perception as being a condition for knowledge? I think probably it's just the really ordinary, everyday, common sense notion that most of the learning that I do happens from perception. That like even if perception isn't defining of knowledge, it seems to be pretty intimately related, related to knowledge, or is commonly related to knowledge. At the very least, there's some sort of associative link here, even if we don't want to say that the essence of knowledge just is perception. So even if we're not going to say it's defining of it, maybe it's sort of related to knowledge. All right. So that's why you see this weird little intermission that happens between the rejection of the perception theory in the reading and when Theaetetus gives his next account. Anyone in the chat, you guys remember what is the next option that Plato considers here for what knowledge might be? This is the other thing. I don't on the video lecture. I don't get to like ask questions to everybody, do a little Socratic teaching. But anyone in the chat remember the next option?
Is it that like chef scenario or something he brought up? I don't know.
The chef thing is another reason why the perception theory is wrong.
Oh, okay. So we're way past this. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I don't remember.
I'm not gonna beat around the bush. I mean, it's a video lecture. I guess the rules are different here. I'll acclimate. The next option that they're gonna consider is knowledge is just true judgment. That's the next option here that Theaetetus offers. And there's a transition here. Just like remember the examples, that was the first thing that was offered, and that was a bad answer. But in recognizing what was wrong with that answer, that it didn't really give us an answer about what the essence of knowledge was, that gave rise to the next suggestion, which at least the perception theory was doing that. It was trying to identify what are the essential conditions here for knowledge. That theory didn't work out, but it also gave us a clue as to maybe where the next one's going to be. And this connecting link here is that intermission I was just referring to. Before I get into that, though, Alexa has a comment in the chat. Says, do you have anything that you believe to be true? Are you saying that like does truth depend on belief? Oh, me. Do I have anything that I believe to be true? Me personally, Tim. Q. Yeah, Cameron. I don't have anything up here right now. I'm gonna put something on top of my head, or I did this, like there. Okay, now I'm just a dude, right? I don't look very professional
That's
at all
good,
anymore. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I do have things that I personally believe are true, but this is something I've emphasized to you guys before. That like the belief that there is objective universal truth does not require me to believe that I know what it is. That those are two different beliefs. It's not like if everything that I tried, if every answer I tried to give you of something I think is universally true, you were able to shoot down or object to or something like that, that wouldn't disprove that there isn't such a thing as universal truth. This is disgusting. There, that's better, huh? I don't know if that's getting to your question there, Alexa, but I'll let you guys know a little bit of my own philosophical views as the quarter goes on if you guys ask. But I generally try to stay out of it and let you guys kind of see just more of the options rather than be too distracted maybe by my opinions. But I'm happy to put my neck out there in the chopping block. Sometimes I think instructors use that as an excuse to not make themselves vulnerable to criticism, and I'm happy to make myself vulnerable to your criticism. I just don't want to turn our class into like Tim's philosophy. That's not what you're here to learn. So speaking of that, let's get back to Plato. Okay, so that interlude, you remember where Plato talks about, he asks a question to Theatetus, is it with the senses that we perceive or through the senses that we perceive? And it sounds like this real like classic philosophical hair-splitting distinctions about weird words and things like that. But there's actually a deep meaning to that. Plato's wondering whether whether thought and consciousness itself is happening with the senses, or if the senses are just like a mechanism or a tool for being sensitive for something else to come to an understanding. So as they kind of are tracing, Theaetetus initially is taken aback by the question too. He's like, I don't really know what you're asking here. So let me kind of walk you through a little bit of the considerations that are happening in this little interlude. So the basic idea is that when I perceive things through the senses, I like make judgments that something's going on in reality. I'm saying something is true. Like I hear a noise and I'm like, what was that? There's something going on over there. The noise, I know because of the noise that there's something happening. Or there's like a flash of light and I see like, no, there's something going on there. Or I just look in front of me and I'm like, there's something going on right here in front of me. I'm like looking at this thing, right? I'm having these sensations. So my different senses always seem to have something that's in common to all of them. This is the kind of bottom line of that whole section, that when I perceive things with the senses, it's really through the senses that I encounter these objects. And really, it's my judgment that something exists that is what's responsible for my knowledge. So, in other words, the things that I'm getting from sensation in perception is really only useful for me in terms of getting at the truth or having knowledge if I do something else other than just am like receptive to perception. I have to make a judgment that something exists. And Plato says that this is something that's a part of all of our sensations. Like I hear the noise and I make the judgment there's something over there, or I see a light and there's something over there. But and this is kind of one of my favorite arguments from this section. Remember, I think I said before to you guys that like reading ancient philosophy is really weird because they're like doing everything from scratch. It's like bare bones, square one, reflection on reality sort of stuff. So sometimes they talk about things in a way that seems weird to us. But there's this moment where he's talking about like, well, what about, so we've got all these different senses. I hear things, I see things, I touch things, I taste things, I smell things. There are all these different modalities of sensation. And it seems like I'm capable of comparing the senses against each other. Like I can maybe coordinate what's happening with sight and sound. Or like when you're watching this video right now, you're getting two different sense modalities. You're getting the visual component, and you're getting the auditory component. And you're able to put them together or like compare them against each other. Like you see something happening, you're like, was that a big enough thing to generate that sound or something like this, right? But it's not like I can encounter sounds through sight. I don't see sounds. I don't taste sight. I don't taste seeing like vision. It doesn't provoke a taste response. So if I'm going to be able to compare the senses against each other, there has to be something other than the senses that's at play here. And the way they put it in the Theatetus is that, well, it's the soul considering these things on its own. And by soul, they really just mean mind. It's just that there's something in which all of these sensations are happening that's capable of comparing them against each other and making judgments about that. And that's the mind. That the mind is making these judgments, is rendering these judgments all on its own accord. When Plato says, and this might have thrown you off, it might not have made any sense in the reading, but when Plato's saying, it would be kind of weird if we were like a Trojan horse that was full of all of these sensations, but there wasn't something that was holding them all, that was like putting them into one like common playground where I'm able to like do something with those things. And as they kind of talk it through, they decide on the answer that it's the mind itself that's using sensations through the sensations, coming to an understanding of what is really real, of making judgments of existence. So that is how we got from perception to true judgment, of saying that like, yeah, perception is involved with knowledge, but on its own, it's not enough. I have to look at the perceptions that I'm having, and then make judgments about them. And it's the judgments that really are going to be uh, where knowledge is going to be found. And it's not just anytime I make a judgment, it's going to count as knowledge. That would get us back into the relativism problem. But now they're bringing in a new notion, true judgment. Maybe that's what counts as knowledge. So making a judgment that something is the case, maybe on the grounds of using perceptions and sensations to justify that judgment, but it has to actually be true. If I made false judgments, that's not going to count as knowledge. So that when we start bringing in this notion of truth, now it's like that thing that I was talking about in class this morning, where there's some third thing. So this person says one thing, and this person says something else. But there's some standard, like we were talking about, the world is maybe this standard, that in as much, like who's right about this? It depends on what's going on in the world. If X is what's true in the world, then T-Rex here is making the correct judgment, and he has knowledge. And Utah Raptor here, poor Utah Raptor, he's not getting it right. Instead of saying Y, let's say he's saying not X. So he says not X, and that is not the right answer, because what's going on in the world, boom, X is what's true. So he got it wrong. False judgment, true judgment. T-Rex gets to know, Utah Raptor does not. Okay, so that's the idea of true judgment in a nutshell. We'll talk more about the details about truth, but that's the core idea, that truth is something that's out there. It's set by the world. So, for example, you guys don't know, but I got this cup here, and the cup may or may not have water in it. And if you make a judgment that the cup has water in it, well, you had a true judgment, because look, there's some water in the cup. If you made the judgment that there was no water in the cup, that's not a true judgment, because that's not what's going on. There is water instead of there being no water. Alexa wonders about a partially true judgment. Well, this is the tricky thing about truth under the standard way of understanding it. It's like the most basic principle of formal logic that we've got. And in fact, if this principle doesn't hold, then there goes all logic and reasoning right out the window. I can give you a proof sometime if you're interested to see how this works. But the principle I'm talking about is the principle of non-contradiction. And it says that for any claim, no matter what the claim is, it is either true or false. It can't be both, it can't be neither, it can't be something in between. That there's no possibility of any of those things happening. It's either true or false. Those are the only two options. If we talk about a claim that's partially true, I think what we're usually saying is that the claim has multiple components to it, and some of those components are true and some of those components are false. But for those components, they aren't partially true or partially false. They're either something is true or it's false. Sometimes we also talk about an answer being like pretty close to the truth, but not quite. Well, still, objectively, it is false. But it might be a better answer than something else, or it'd be kind of like if I'm trying to draw a picture. Let's see, so I can see Daniel's face down there, and I try to like draw a picture of it, and I draw it. I mean, this is really quick, but it's like something like this, right? I'm like, well, that picture is sort of close, like maybe it's accurate, but there could be a more accurate picture that I draw or something like that. Is this a true depiction of Daniel? Well, that might be hard to say, but for any kind of well-formed propositional claim, it's going to be either true or false. That's the basic idea here. If we really wanted to do a deconstruction of my picture here of Daniel, we could say, well, this part of it is an accurate depiction according to certain standards that are going to make the translation or not. But like, is this what Daniel looks like objectively? No, it doesn't. That we maybe got on a little bit of a tangent there, but at least for this kind of notion of truth, the standard notion of the principle of non-contradiction, claims are either true or false. Another thing that can maybe throw a monkey wrench in here that might make you say there's some gray area, like I said just a second ago, for any well-formed propositional claim, there might be some propositions or statements that we make that are really ambiguous as to what they're really saying. And I can't evaluate the truth of a claim that I don't really understand. So like if someone is asked, maybe this picture thing is a good example. If someone asked me, is that picture true of Daniel? I might be like, what are you asking? Like, what would it mean for this picture to be a true picture? I mean, what are we saying there? I mean, pictures are never exactly what they are. They never perfectly represent things. So what is the claim that you're making about this picture? And in order for me to figure out whether that claim is true or false. So maybe that's another thing that can kind of throw a monkey wrench in here, is just lack of clarity about what we're saying. Okay, so the true judgment account is our next proposal. And the true judgment account doesn't live very long either. It gets rejected pretty darn quickly for a major reason. So that one gets X'd out too. And again, the problem here is going to guide us to the last and final answer that the Plato reading considers. That the problems that show up here are going to guide us to the next answer. But let's talk a little bit about the problems with saying that knowledge is just true judgment. In contemporary language, when we talk about judgment, we're really just talking about belief. What do you believe to be true? And if your belief about what is true is what is actually the case, then that's what the true judgment account would consider as knowledge. But can you guys think of any cases of someone making a true judgment that doesn't seem to fit as knowledge, or doesn't seem to count as knowledge? What do you guys think? Any examples that you could come up with of that? Can you think of any examples of something that is a true belief that someone has, but you wouldn't be comfortable calling it knowledge? I'm not sure what that answer would mean, Cameron.
Religion, like, Jesus died and then rose from the grave 3 days later.
So if someone formed that belief and it is actually true, you wouldn't count it as knowledge?
Oh, wait, no, I misunderstood. So what? Wait, say that again. What are we thinking?
So we're looking for an example of someone who meets the condition of having a true judgment. That is, they form a belief about reality, and that's exactly how reality actually is. But it doesn't count as knowledge.
Like calling this wife beater white. Like, it is white, but it doesn't make it, like, I don't know.
You don't know that it's white?
Well, no, I know it's white, but I mean, I'm not knowledgeable about wife beaters. I don't know.
I think you are, Tommy. Don't sell yourself short on that. I think you are acquainted with them. Here's an example I can give. Actually, I've got a bunch of these things. Like, I've got all these games over here. I should be able to find something quickly. Come on. Oh, my games are too complicated. I was looking for some dice, but I don't need to show you a dice to make this example. Let's say I decided that I was going to predict the outcome of the next presidential election. I'm going to make a prediction that, like, a Republican's going to win the the presidential election. I think a Republican's going to win. And what's the basis of me deciding to form this belief? Well, I rolled a dice, and if it came up odd, I was going to believe that. If it came up even, I was going to predict that a Democrat is going to win the election. And let's say it turns out that a Republican does win an election, the next election. Would you say that I knew that? That I had knowledge that a Republican was going to win the next election? No, you wouldn't, right? But that situation meets all the conditions that our last theory was saying for what knowledge consists in. I made a judgment, and it turned out to be true. So those kinds of examples abound, that there's all sorts of cases where we might form a belief, and it might just so happen to be true, but that doesn't count for knowledge. In contemporary discussion, yes, that is exactly the word, Cameron. That's just what I was going to say. In contemporary discussions, this is usually referred to as the problem of lucky knowledge. That basically, what our pre-theoretical beliefs about knowledge are is that it can't be lucky. You can't be lucky that you knew something. It can't work that way. It's got to be you got to make sure you got to eliminate luck in your conditions for knowledge in order for it to be a correct account of what knowledge is. I like Plato's example. It's a little more complicated than me rolling a dice and making a prediction, but I think it's a really good one. Plato talks about this case where people are a jury at a trial, and there's a really good lawyer who is convincing the jury that they know something about this case that, as Plato describes it, is something that only an eyewitness who is present would be able to have known. Okay? Now, the thing that the lawyer is convincing them of is actually true. So normally we might think about someone who's a clever, convincing, conniving person as trying to just convince people of things that are false. But what if someone used that same ability to try to convince people of something that was true? And those people came to a belief on the basis of this like fancy rhetorical speech that the person offered. Even if it's right, Plato's saying, don't we have the intuition that they don't really know it? Like, even though the jury's been convinced by this lawyer's like incredible oratory abilities, and they're right, that doesn't mean that they have knowledge. Does that case make sense to you guys? Yeah? I like this a lot. This is a little tangent I'm going to go on. It's a good one. I think a lot of us think that we are open-minded people who want people to be open-minded and to think about things in an open-minded sort of way. But we also have a whole lot of beliefs about how we think the world is and how we think people ought to obey within it. Like we have different ideals. And even if we say that we're open-minded about it, I think a good test to see whether we really are sincere about wanting people to kind of know the truth or come to know the truth for themselves is, what would you do if the world, if like what you believe, like everything that you think is true, the things that you hold as your opinion about reality, was shared by everyone else? What if culture was completely designed around it? What if everyone had the like consensus that what you were saying is right? What would you do in that situation? You guys are all familiar with these kinds of themes about how different types of sociological and psychological factors like cultural influences can like bias us to do groupthink or conformist behavior and that kind of thing. So imagine those forces being present just like they are now, except they're all directed toward beliefs that you endorse. So it's like you found yourself in a society, in a culture that like perfectly reflects your worldview. Like perfectly. What would you do? Would you throw a monkey wrench into things for people? Would you start playing devil's advocate and like attacking the beliefs that you actually espouse to try to like get people to have an authentic basis for their belief? Or would you just kind of go along with it and be like, this is great. Sure. Yeah, you think that too? Awesome. Right? I think we do this with our friends all the time. I mean, I can only speak from personal experience, I guess, but what I've observed just with like my own friends and even a tendency inside of myself, like I'm like, I really care about truth seeking. But sometimes when you're hanging out with people and it like feels good when someone's like, totally, man, I totally agree, rather than the person who's like, yeah, I agree with you, but are you so sure about that? I'm like, throw a monkey wrench into things like, what about this? What about that? Always like pushing the buttons and challenging things. I don't know. I always like that kind of uh, uh, tangent to talk about here, that kind of test about like the sincerity in which you champion authentic truth seeking and that sort of thing. It's easy to complain about the biasing forces when they're for things that you disagree with. But what about if those biasing forces were for things that you agree with? And this is kind of Plato's point here about knowledge, that it depends on what basis we form this judgment, or what we can say about this judgment, what we can back it up with in order for it to count as knowledge. Because otherwise, it might just be due to factors that are lucky or that are kind of like biasing factors, things that have nothing to do with linking us up with the truth. And it just so happens that on whatever wacky basis we formed our belief, it syncs up with reality. that's not good enough for knowledge, that we need something more. And this is where we get. Are we guys so far so good? Are we ready to move on? Throw some more stuff on the table? Yeah? Okay, cool. Stop me if more questions come up. So we get to our last and final answer here or the one that they're going to consider in the Theatetus about what knowledge is. And like I said, the true judgment one didn't live very long, but it's going to form the foundation for the new and final theory that we're going to consider. And that is, as he puts it in Plato, true judgment with an account. Or in contemporary lingo, JTB. Justified true belief. So the belief thing, that's the judgment. The true is still, I mean, true just is still in there. With an account, that's what we're talking about as justification. That I have to say something to back up my belief in order for it to, and it has to be true, in order for it to count as knowledge. And Cameron asks, what makes for the justification? That is the sticky question here. And in the Plato reading, they offer 3 different versions of what justification could count as, or what having an account could look like, what we could mean by having an account. I told you guys this morning that the JTB model is the most traditional, long-standing, and still the most mainstream answer for understanding what knowledge is in philosophy. But there's incredible amount of debate and a whole lot of different theories and positions on what is the correct version of JTB, and most of it comes down to the justification part. There is some philosophical work that is done on trying to explain what we mean by true. So there is discussions about the nature of truth here and how that works, what it would take for a judgment to be true. There's some discussion there. And there is some discussion about what it takes to have a belief. Like, what do I have to be doing to form a belief? What are beliefs at all? I did some work on this in cognitive science in my graduate studies about trying to understand just what are the content of claims or propositions that we make, which are what our beliefs are about. The content of a belief will be a particular claim or proposition, and I did some work on that. So there is some questions here about the T part and the B part, but really most of the action is around justification. And I promised you guys that on Wednesday I'm going to give you this little extra bonus lecture on some contemporary epistemic accounts, and most of them are going to differ on how they understand justification, and there's some widely different answers here. But let's look at the answers that Plato gives. Okay, and I want to say something else here before I finish off this lecture here. One thing is that I kind of cut down the readings for you guys. I give you selections out of these readings, and sometimes it's hard to decide what to keep in and what to cut out, especially because in the class I'm not able to talk about everything. Like in these lectures, we're already pushing 50 minutes here on the lecture, and there's still a bunch more things I want to talk to you guys about tonight. And one of the sections that is probably going to get the short end of the stick here is that crazy section before they get to this last bit on justified true belief or true judgment with an account, where they talk about parts and wholes. Do you remember this? This is in philosophy. This is called mereology, and it's one of the more confusing elements of metaphysics about what makes up objects. That it seems like this is a whole, like this object right here. It's a whole, but it's made up of parts. But is the whole just the sum of the parts? Or is the whole something that's in addition to the sum of the parts? Or what should we think about this? And it's all weird and wacky and that sort of thing. There is a logic of parts and wholes, but it is very tricky to understand. So I wanted to give you that because it is kind of an interesting topic in philosophy. And really, one of the versions of having an account is just having an account of the parts of something. And they kind of explore that option and then discard it in this section of the Theatetus where they're talking about parts and wholes. The basic idea here, maybe I can I'll give a shot at summarizing it really, really quickly. I won't give myself a lot of time here. And if you've got more questions about it, please feel free to talk. This is a great topic for outside of class discussion if you're curious. The reason why that I'm even considering talking about it is that it's not just a weird thing that ancient Greek philosophers who were so confused about things had questions about. It's still a major issue today, and in fact, my work in cognitive science was like majorly concerned with this question itself. One of the ideas here is that, well, maybe I can't have knowledge of the most basic simples of reality, like the atoms, the most basic components of reality. Like we've talked before about like the taste of peppermint ice cream. Like I can't really give you a definition of that. It seems like a simple that I'm acquainted with directly. There's no account, there's no explanation, there's nothing there that I can give you as a description. Just like either you are acquainted with that experience or you're not. And that's all there is to it. But maybe I can have knowledge with an account when I start getting acquainted with all these different parts and then I put them into a whole. So I can understand the whole on the basis of understanding all of its little parts. Maybe something like that could count as knowledge on the grounds of true judgment with an account. But that generates a bunch of paradoxes for the true judgment with an account theory. That, well, how can I know the wholes because I can give an account of their parts, but I can't understand the parts directly? I mean, if the whole is made out of the parts, how do I know the whole and not know the parts? That seems weird. Unless maybe the whole was something other than the parts, that it was something more than the parts. But if we're going to talk about it there being something more than just the parts, well, then that's some other simple thing that doesn't have component parts that I also can't know because there's no account to give of its parts. Okay, if that made no sense, don't worry about it. But if that is something you're curious about, or you're like, what's going on there? This is actually a pretty big deal in contemporary philosophy, in discussions about what are the identities of concepts. That's the work that I did in cognitive science about concept identity. And there's still going to be this parts wholes sort of problem there, especially when we start thinking about trying to make computers that could possibly have consciousness, who could think. How are we going to program them to have certain concepts? What are the content of those concepts that we think about? So anyway, I'll leave it at that. That was a couple minutes on that little tangent, but don't worry about it. Okay, I will get to the code word here. I'll have to think of something, but I'm too fired up right now to talk about justified true belief or true judgment with an account, so I want to get rolling on that. There's three options that Plato gives us for what it could mean to have an account. The first one gets dismissed pretty quickly. The first one is saying basically giving an account is being able to explain your idea. And honestly, I think that this is an option that's at least worth mentioning in Plato's discussion of knowledge. That seems like a really bad standard to hold someone accountable to for knowledge. But I think it's worth still discussing because actually, if I observe how people receive information and how they decide what to believe, sometimes you could make a claim and someone's like, I'm not sure, I think that that's true. But just by giving a more detailed explanation of it, someone starts to gain confidence that what you're saying is true, even though you've given no evidence for it or any reasons for justification or anything like that. Just by being able to speak about it, you sound knowledgeable. And Plato calls this theory out rightfully, I think, as being not sufficient for knowledge. Because basically anyone with an idea is going to be capable of doing that. So if we're trying to, if the whole idea was to add this notion of an account into true judgment to prevent these cases of lucky knowledge, requiring that people trying to set the conditions for knowledge a little more narrow by requiring that people be able to explain their idea, that's not restricting it. That's restricting it almost not at all. So we're going to need something that's a little harsher here to make sure that that our theory doesn't count some things as knowledge that really aren't knowledge. Actually, that's a way that you can think about the transition here between all these different theories. That the knowledge as perception model left it pretty wide open here about what could count as knowledge. It kept too many things out. So then we put true judgment. That knocked it down a little bit. And now we're that's not good enough, because now we're letting some things count as knowledge that really shouldn't count as knowledge. So now let's say true judgment with an account. But what we mean by an account better be something that's going to create some more restrictions here. So just requiring that people be able to explain their idea, that's not good enough for having an account. on the road to having knowledge. Okay, so that's the first option. The second option that they consider, I think this one's pretty hard to understand right off the page. The way they're talking about it, like this example of being able to spell out the letters in someone's name as a way of knowing the name. But here's really the idea that Plato is getting at. Maybe having an account just means that there's some principled procedure that I used as a basis for having knowledge. So however I decided what I was going to believe, like what belief I was going to form, was on the basis of some systematic and non-arbitrary procedure for how I was going to form that belief. That's starting to sound a little more demanding. That I don't just, like, when I rolled the dice, I'm like, that's the procedure I used, and that's not a very robust procedure. But if I was like, well, I looked at the possible answers and I ran them through these standards that I have, maybe, and that's how I decided which thing to form as a belief, maybe that's getting closer to what we're looking for knowledge of true judgment with an account. Does that make sense to you guys? Is this working? Yep. Cool. But Plato has some problems with this proposal too. This one might have some merit to it, and in fact, this is going to be one of the seeds of an idea for a contemporary epistemic theory that I'll tell you guys about on Wednesday at that special lecture time. But Plato's problem with it is that when people are first, like when a student is first learning how to do something, they're learning like the rule, the procedure, but it doesn't seem like they have this extra special something, this understanding. They might just be following a pattern and they don't really know what they're doing. I definitely sympathize with this when I'm teaching formal logic to my students, or maybe if I was a math teacher, I'd have a similar experience. Formal logic is it's kind of like a game with symbols. And I can teach a student how to play the logic game, and they might not have a frickin' clue what the hell they're doing, but they can get the right answer. So they're able to get true judgment, and they had a procedure to arrive at that true judgment, but do they have knowledge? Do I think they really understand logic just because they were able to derive the right answer? They may be lacking that understanding of why they're doing what they're doing in the way that they're doing it. So maybe the idea of true judgment with an account, where we understand by an account some non-arbitrary procedure for arriving at your belief, maybe that is still not good enough for knowledge. Maybe that's still too permissive and we need something more restrictive. Okay. Oh, where I'm talking about in the reading? Yeah, actually, and I'll pull it up for people who are watching this on YouTube too. Here's the reading. Let me find the page where we're talking about this. So on page nope, not that. A little bit further. Okay. When he starts talking about the three different versions of what an account could mean, this is on page 229 on the PDF, or in the page numbers on the PDF, it's like 22 out of 27. And the first option here is saying, the first would be, Socrates says, making one's thought apparent vocally by means of words and verbal expressions, when a man impresses an image of his judgment upon the stream of speech, like reflections upon water or in a mirror. Don't you think that this kind of thing is an account? Theaetetus says, yes, I do. At least a man who does this is said to be giving an account. And then Socrates immediately dismisses it in the next paragraph, because he's like, well, that's pretty much everyone can do that if they're not deaf or dumb to begin with. So that's not restrictive enough. But then they're like, maybe there's another option. And then they start talking about the second option, and it's really weird. So I just gave an explanation of that. The reading is kind of hard. It's hard to pull that out of the reading itself. But let's look here. There's still one more account. This is happening on page 231 or on page 24 out of 27. When Socrates starts saying, so maybe it was only a poor man's dream of gold that we had when we thought we had the truest account of knowledge, or is it early days to be harsh? Perhaps this is not the way in which one is to define an account. We said that the man who defines knowledge as correct judgment together with an account would choose one of these three meanings for account. Perhaps the last one is the one to define it by. And Theatetus is like, okay, yeah, now what's your third suggestion? Socrates says, what the majority of people would say So Plato or Socrates thinks that this is the most intuitive answer we could give, namely, being able to tell some mark by which the object you are asked about differs from other things. So what Plato's sort of proposing here with the third version of an account is that I'm able to give what we might call the definitive evidence or a demonstrative proof, the definitive mark of what makes this true as opposed to false. So let's say there was some like issue that you were confused about. You're like, I'm not sure whether to think it's this or that. Maybe someone has sort of guided you through these dilemmas by asking you to like articulate, well, how would you know what the true answer would be? Like, what would make the difference there? Like, what would be the case in one version, one possible answer, or one possibility versus the other? What would make for the difference? Like let's say you've got a friend and you're like, I'm not sure if my friend is lying to me or not. He said this the other day and I'm not sure whether to trust him. Maybe he's lying, maybe he's telling the truth. And another friend might be like, well, what would be the definitive mark of him telling the truth? Like, is he an honest person? How do I decide about honesty? What's like a definitive mark of this? Maybe we could figure that out. And then if I have knowledge that that's true of him, then I can trust him. Or there might be a definitive mark of his lying. Like maybe I know about my friend that every time he's lying, he like rubs his nose a lot. So that's like his tell in poker or something. So if I see him rubbing his nose, then I'm like, no, he's lying, because that's the definitive mark of my friend lying. Okay, does that make sense? That poker tell thing is a perfect example of what Plato is talking about here. How you guys doing? Yeah, sweet, Gucci. No, I get all my stuff at Goodwill. Yeah. So yeah, that's this third account. Now, there's a big problem with this account, and this is where the dialogue leaves us off. And the idea here is that let's take stock of what we just said. So, in order to have knowledge, we've got to have, there it is, true judgment with an account. So in order for me to know, let's say, in order for me to know that my friend is lying, I need to make the judgment that he's lying. It has to actually be true, like he has to be truly lying, and I have to have an account. And on this third version, we're saying having an account means that I know the definitive mark of what would make my judgment true. In this case, that he's got this tell, that he rubs his nose when he's lying. Okay? So I'd have to know that he rubs his nose when he's lying in order to know that he is lying. So I'd have to have, this is the problem, I'd have to have some other knowledge in order to have the account that would enable me to have the original knowledge. So in other words, in order to know, I have to know something else, the evidence that I base my judgment or belief on. So if in order to know, I have to know something else, well then how do I know that? In order to know that, I'd have to know something else that's the definitive mark of that being true. What's the definitive mark of knowing that this tell is when he's lying? I'd have to know that too. And in order to know that, I'd have to know the definitive mark of that thing. And so on and so forth all the way back. So basically, if knowledge depends on evidence, then it seems like we have an endless regress problem here for justification. That I won't basically know anything because I'm not going to be able to have that definitive evidence going all the way back. In some versions of this objection, I've heard it articulated that this basically means that in order to know any particular thing, I would have to know all things. I'd have to be totally omniscient. That seems like an absurd result for the theory. So that's a reason to maybe throw out this version of true judgment with an account. Maybe there's some other options out there for what we could mean by an account. But with all the options that Plato has looked at here, and all the other theories that we've looked at, the examples, the perception theory, the true judgment account, or the true judgment version theory on its own, and then the true judgment with an account and the three different variations on that, those all have come up empty, or they've been vulnerable to some pretty serious objections. And like I said, in this one piece of writing, it's just chock full of so many good ideas and inspiring ideas that have given rise to various different moral or epistemic theories. Gosh, it's getting too tired. My brain is failing me. It's given rise to so many different contemporary epistemic theories. So I'm going to share some of those with you guys on Wednesday. But that's it for my little discussion of Plato tonight. So that was a lot. We crammed a lot in there. Got it done in 65 minutes. I can't believe it. But how are we doing from the chat room here? I want to hear from you guys if you got some questions, because I think the whole class can benefit from that. Getting questions from you guys definitely makes these lectures better. So anything from the whole night, shoot, hit me up. Any questions? I'll try to answer them. So Lawrence was asking, isn't this essentially the same basis by which many sciences work, like chemistry, and the definitive mark would be the result of an experiment? That is exactly right. That's at least what science is aiming to do, that if its evidence is going to count as any evidence, it might have to have that kind of definitive mark. Now, things get a little more complicated for science, as we're going to see in probably next week. Next week we're definitely going to get into this with David Hume and the problem of induction. All science, in any case of the science that we do, having knowledge of that definitive mark does depend on having other kind of background knowledge. And sometimes science has gotten into trouble because it's been like trying to make its conclusions based on some background assumptions that are false. Now, we still have belief that by doing the scientific method and by continuing with this process more, that we're able to like uncover where those mistaken beliefs are, those mistaken background assumptions are, and then correct them. But still, every scientific argument on the planet or that ever has been made is very fallible in as much as it depends on certain background assumptions being true in order for it to count as even a good argument, in order for the evidence to count as any kind of evidence whatsoever. And there's going to be some other deeper problems here with induction that Hume's going to help point out for us. But just that basic kind of level of fallibility is what's going on there. There have been a lot of attempts by contemporary philosophers today to try to justify science in the face of these kinds of concerns. That maybe there's something about scientific reasoning, or the way that science uses evidence, or the nature of knowledge itself, that would let that stuff maybe count in a more definitive sort of way, that we could actually get more certainty out of this thing that otherwise maybe is somewhat uncertain or on kind of shaky ground. Yes, and code word. Thanks, Alexa, for reminding me about the code word. What should be the code word tonight? Well, we talked about lawyers, so let's do Phoenix Wright. And Phoenix, you guys know how to spell Phoenix? Phoenix, and it's not right, it's W-R-I-G-H-T. Phoenix wrong. Objection. Anyway. Lawrence says here, option 3 makes sense with regards to scientific theories as well, because while it's true until proven false, it's also only true until a better explanation comes up, so it's accepted but not absolutely known. I actually think science doesn't work that way, Lawrence. I don't think it's true until proven false in science. It's more like burden of proof is to show that it's actually true. It's not just like I cook up some crazy hypothesis and we're just going to roll with that until someone can contradict it. There's a demand here that I provide some evidence to back up my claims, the same way that in Plato's account of knowledge here, making a judgment requires justification. I got to have some basis on which I'm basing that belief in order for it to have even a shot of being counting as knowledge. Other questions about just what's been going on here with Plato and our discussion of knowledge? Has my lecture really made it that crystal clear? I think there's probably got to be some questions here. Oh, you're gonna save it for the forum, man. Okay, I love the forum. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think it's great that you guys talk to each other on the forum, and I try to follow along as much as I can. But I want to talk with you guys about it. And I have noticed in a few cases that the discussions that happen on the boards, sometimes you guys are speculating about what things mean, and kind of get some consensus about something that I think is maybe a misinterpretation or a misconception too. So I don't. I'd like to have you guys ask me questions too. I mean, it's cool to talk with each other and try to work it out in a group sort of way. I think there's awesome learning that happens in that kind of setting where you guys are like helping each other out and doing things cooperatively, and that's what I don't want to interfere with and spoil. But I also think that I'm a pretty good resource here for trying to like sort things out and understand what's happening. And so I don't want you guys to be shy or not come to me about it. So yeah. Oh, you want to see what other people's opinions are too? Okay, that's fair. That's cool. And you're right, Lawrence. Lawrence is talking here some more stuff about science. And you're right that in science, I mean, no scientist thinks that they've got absolute certainty with what they're claiming. I mean, all the ones that I've talked to don't talk like that. Sometimes other people talk about science as having that absolute certainty, but really the scientists are much more modest about this. They're like, yeah, I mean, I'm just following the evidence and seeing where it leads. And this is the best option that we've got so far. This seems to be what all the evidence is pointing to. But the history of science is just loaded with examples where there was something that people were pretty confident about, and then something else happened, some new evidence came to light, or some other test that we weren't doing before, and we figured out a better answer. So that, and the old thing was overturned. So I think scientists this day understand that for the most part, and they're pretty modest in their claims, while still aiming for certainty and still continuing to work at it. For cognition, I'm curious to know how you define knowledge for a machine versus that for a human. Well, that's an interesting question. Pretty much, it's got to be the same standard. That there's not going to be a different standard here for different types of beings in terms of knowledge. At least on most of the standard versions of what knowledge consists in. I might talk on Wednesday about this position called variantism or contextualism, which thinks that under certain context or circumstances, the standards for knowledge can be raised or lowered. But most epistemologists believe that the standards for knowledge are set and universal, and they don't change. That there's no like double standards or something like that going on. So I don't think that there'd be a difference between humans versus machines. And that's a very interesting statement you make. A machine is more based on fact than we are. I'm not so certain about that. I mean, for one thing, I think the machines we have right now, like computers and stuff, they miss out on one of the most foundational aspects of this formula for knowledge. They don't really have beliefs. Computers don't have beliefs. They don't form judgments. Um, they're basically like the way I recorded information here on this little tablet. Like this thing doesn't know anything just because I wrote it on here. Like I said, my keys are in my pocket. This thing doesn't know that just because it was recorded. A computer is basically something like that. There'd have to be a quantum leap here in what's happening with artificial intelligence to maybe count as having a robust belief state. There's a lot more to that, but I'll leave it at that for now. Okay, and then there's some questions here about paper outlines and what's going on with that. Do you guys have any other questions with Plato? I think I'm gonna, if there's no other questions about Plato, I'll stop the recording. Okay. Good night, everybody. Not to you guys, not saying goodbye to you because we can keep talking after I'm done recording. But goodbye to everyone who's watching the video lecture, and I will see you on Wednesday.